at GA this year was a result of a really big problem we had in the UUA a few years ago when our senior-most leaders, including the president of the UUA, Peter Morales, resigned their post. The commission was appointed to determine what can be done in the UUA to bring about institutional change that we know results from white supremacy culture. I want to begin by giving a shout out to the Reverend Leslie Takahashi, who chaired the Commission on Institutional Change, for her leadership and her persistence. It didn't take me long to realize there's no way I can do justice to the UUA Commission on Institutional Change's report, Widening the Circle of Concern, in 20 minutes. There's too much content, history, recommendations, and calls to action to discuss and raise consciousness. Consider this one among other sermons I will preach from the report. You can find the full report on our website under the tab, The Current Crisis, and I encourage each one of you to read it. Some among us are already engaging in the work. I want the members of the 8th Principal Team and those engaged in reading the books, Growing Up White and White Fragility, to acknowledge themselves. Just unmute yourself and say your name, please.
Jane Ash.
Judy
Marie and
Licht.
Rod.
Judy Licht.
Dale Emmert, Cindy Bryce,
Mark Sukantarek,
Carly Campbell,
Catherine Massey,
Susan
John
Hitchcock.
Seeley.
Marie and Rod.
Juli.Sanchez.
I thank all of you for the work that you're doing. I believe this is the work that we're called to do now, and you are leading the way for us to have a groundswell of work breaking down and dismantling white supremacy culture in our congregation. You may have asked yourself, what does Edward P. Jones' Pulitzer Prize winning novel, The Known World, have to do with me? The passage describes the end journey of an enslaved Black woman, Rita, who got shipped to Baltimore in a wooden box during slavery. A Black man shipped her to a white woman to prevent her killing in Richmond. When the box arrived, the woman and her 12-year-old son stood there speechless as they opened it. The first words from the enslaved woman's mouth were, "Don't send me back." For many Black, Indigenous people and people of color, we use the acronym BIPOCs, in the Unitarian Universalist world, being sent back lives in our DNA. As Resmaa Menakem declared in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, the race trauma is in our bodies. We thought we had gotten past overt racism with the Civil Rights Bill. Then with the hundreds of firsts for BIPOCs in America, people like Jackie Robinson and Mae Jemison, Colin Powell, who have been the first in their field as people of color. We really thought we'd move forward when we elected Obama. As Ta-Nehisi Coates' book declared, we were 8 years in power. Then Hillary Clinton lost. Now we're in a pandemic, which has caused a recession. We all know when white America is in a recession, BIPOCs are in a depression. And BIPOCs are not going back to pre-Obama days. At the headquarters level of the UUA, this is a golden age of racial equity. There's more shared leadership with BIPOCs than ever before. In congregations, however, serious work awaits us. Black, Indigenous people, and people of color join our churches hoping we take seriously the first principle that all people have inherent worth. We join our churches expecting UUs to already be living up to that principle fully, only to discover in many churches they are only words. The words mean little, and often people have no competency living them out. Instead, the BIPOCs experience microaggression after microaggression by white people who have the faintest idea of what they do. A microaggression is a comment or behavior that others, and that is a verb, that others or demean someone because of their culturally marginalized identity. Here are a couple common microaggressions from UU spaces taken from the report. Where are you really from? You must be new to Unitarian Universalism. This is the one that my wife Tamara gets frequently. On page 58, there is a printable PDF with guidelines for stopping harm and responding to microaggressions. We can root American history in race. It includes depending on enslaved Black people, the genocide of Native Americans, ending Reconstruction, Jim Crow segregation, Ku Klux Klan terror, Dr. King's death, Emmett Till's murder, hatred of Barack Obama, and on down to this moment started by George Floyd's death. Now we witness the Breonna Taylor case playing out. All this history unravels with the current unrest. You may wonder, how is this passage from the known world related? There is a direct link between the known world, written in 2003, and widening the circle of concern. On pages 122 and 124 of the report, you'll find a detailed history from First Parish UU in Needham, Massachusetts. The historical papers tell us how they built and maintained First Parish with enslaved labor, how the first two ministers, Reverends Jonathan Townsend and Samuel West, baptized enslaved Black children on August 19, 1775, and how they maintained its upkeep with an enslaved Black sexton. The words are chilling to read, but here's a passage. On June 5th, 1754, the Reverend Mr. Townsend was granted £1, 1 shilling, 4 pence for his servants taking care of the meeting house in 1753. This was probably the Homer who died April 9th, 1754. I lift this history from the report as evidence that white supremacy culture within the UUA has roots within our churches. It's our history. It is a fact, not fantasy. This is the living tradition we must accept exists and survives today. We inherited this legacy through our theological DNA. It is a legacy that many will deny exists or has current day relevance. It has everything to do with the current day within our churches and our denomination or association. Our ancestors, both white and Black, passed it down to us. The Commission's report is full of examples of how white supremacy culture in contemporary UUism continues to impact BIPOCs in our movement. Read the letters from the avatars. First Parish Unitarian Universalism of Needham, Massachusetts legacy has a direct line to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Las Cruces and the other 879 UU congregations. The report says much has not changed over decades in UUism. The enslaved woman's words, Rita, "Don't send me back," are my words. They are the words of all Black, Indigenous people, and people of color in our congregations who don't want to go back to the pre-Obama era. BIPOCs continue facing the same treatment disguised in microaggressions. As your minister, I have experienced my share of micro and macroaggressions against me. I won't detail them here, but they are real. And you can read about some of them in my upcoming book titled The Black UU Lives Survival Guide. I and many BIPOCs have had the enslaved readers in the wooden box experience as a UU minister. This doesn't mean I felt enslaved. It means I and the other BIPOCs in our churches have had similar experiences, whether or not they have spoken about them. They lay face down in a metaphorical wooden box filled with waste, and hearing the nails pulled from the wooden box was like the sound of an oncoming army in their minds and bodies. When they say, or when we say, don't send me back, in whatever words we use, they meet Mary and Timothy's black stare, which conveys the meaning, what are you talking about? I'm not portraying this legacy from our spiritual ancestors as a battle axe or instrument meant to cause pain. I want us to examine and grieve our past, invite UUs to acknowledge and claim it, but not get stuck in it. UU BIPOCs need you to acknowledge the benefits that white supremacy culture conveys to white UUs. The report calls UUs to find ways to, quote, make room for repentance and saying when we have failed, end quote. Black and brown people and indigenous people in our midst. This is paramount if UUs want to move forward and work off white supremacy in our UU culture. If you cannot do this confessional work, you are erecting barriers for becoming multiculturally competent. I speak of a confession similar to AA, where speakers stand up and say, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic. That confession marks accepting responsibility for their lives, committing the truth, and becoming someone new. It's unlikely you will stop biases against BIPOCs without confessing your part in it. That is, unless you are like my father. He was an alcoholic and early anti-racist, but had willpower to quit drinking cold turkey. He didn't understand people who needed AA. And my mother swore he quit because his doctor told him he was going to die. Whatever the impulse, confession is an important part of the work, or else we'll live in a culture of denial. That relieves people of accountability and empowers them to refute their words and actions that caused hurt. You could instead take a page from the AA Big Book and, I quote, make direct amends to people you've caused harm wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others, end quote. Widening the circle of concern argues white people must stop, I quote, overlooking the special gifts and intelligences of people who already know how to resist and survive in these times, end quote. Without that change, folks remain blind to the harms caused to BIPOCs. In 1989, a report titled, We Have No Problem Again, from the Black Concerns Working Group included the following words, and this comes from the Commission's report also. That the majority refusal to acknowledge and accept the firsthand knowledge that people of color, indigenous, and other marginalized groups face within our frames is maddening to those who experienced it and over again. I want to repeat that. That the majority refusal to acknowledge and accept the firsthand knowledge that people of color, indigenous, and other marginalized groups face within our frames is maddening to those who experienced it over and over among us. We can write that same report today, 30 years later, with the same veracity. Now, I must keep this sermon real, or as we say today, keep it 100. There are actions that can happen here in our church, and there are several on page 47, which I invite you to read at your leisure. But here are mine. We can request a white supremacy teach-in from congregational consultants. We can conduct a church-wide racism audit or do a multiculturalism audit as proposed on page 53. You can get to know your fellow UUs of color. I mean, really get to know who they are. And how would you know if you know them? Well, can you talk to them as you do your white friends? If you can't, there's work and relationship to build. Do you invite them to your house or try to spend time together? If not, there's friendship and hospitality to do. I can say that I've written letters and emails to people here and invited them to get to know me and Tamara. 8 out of 10 of those invitations go unanswered. That, my friends, is a microaggression. I remain convinced people should request a personal consultation as a follow-up to their intercultural developmental inventory, the work that we did almost a year ago with Reverend Dr. Jonathan Kwong. That will keep you 100. We need more ways to center Black, Indigenous people, and people of color leadership. That means making BIPOC leaders experience primary and don't shut it down. Finally, stay at the table and stop the fragility. As a UU religious educator, the Reverend Dr. Natalie Fenimore says in the report, while Unitarian Universalists value democracy, it is best not seen as democracy in the purely political sense. This is not about winning by vote alone, but rather as honoring the voices of all and listening to the call of conscience. In other words, when things don't go your way, don't center your feelings and leave the table. Stay engaged, take a risk and listen, and learn from those who know how to resist and survive in these times. We have made amazing progress in the UUA. We've had 5 Black, Indigenous people of color UUA presidents. 3 of them served as co-presidents immediately following the commission's appointment. And 3 of them were the ones that convened the leaders for the meeting that Katie read the report from, or the preface. We've had a Black co-moderator, Elandria Williams, whose video we watched today, whose term just ended in 2020. The director of congregational life is an African-American, Jessica York. And here at the UUCLC, we have 5 Black, Indigenous people or people of color on the staff, 2 on the board, and we have our 8th principal team. But much work remains on the table. I preached 2 sermons on covenant. The report says that covenant and commitment, not comfort, should be the binding fabrics of UU congregations. We need a congregational covenant, one that incorporates multiculturalism and navigating conflict. There's a remarkable series on Netflix called Unorthodox. It's about a 19-year-old Orthodox Jewish woman who marries a man in their community in Brooklyn, New York. She flees her community to survive and find her true self. She lands in Germany and lives wherever she could find warmth until she encountered a community that welcomed and accepted her. Meanwhile, the Orthodox community sends her husband and his cousin to retrieve her and take her back to Brooklyn. They find her and using, and I quote from the report, derision, false news, and shoddy research masquerading as truth, unquote, words from the report, they tried to convince her she couldn't survive without her community. She says to them, "Don't take me back." But she also says, "I won't go back." Let us say to each other that we won't go back to a time when white privilege was the centering value and BIPOCs, Black, Indigenous people, and people of color, were marginalized. In reality, the time is now, and we still are marginalized, but we still can make a commitment to not stay there. May we do our individual and shared confessional work recommended by the UUA Commission on Institutional Change. Then let us be about breaking down white supremacy culture within our faith and church. May we all develop the mantra, we are not going back. Instead of greeting Black, Indigenous people, and people of color, and other marginalized people with blank stares, may we open our eyes wide and create ways to become a new community. Ashe, and may it be so.
Despite the fact that we must practice social distancing in order to